Basically, when we talk about globalization, I have in mind a situation where there is relatively unrestricted flow of goods and services and of capital, including above all finance, across country borders. Now, that is the kind of globalization we have today. When you look at the past, while you have had episodes of globalization, none of them has been of the kind that we have today. In other words, contemporary globalization is far more complete. At least because past global globalizations, past episodes were always hamstrung by, were all limited by the fact that they occurred within a colonial, semi colonial environment. And that really limited globalization in a number of ways. If we look, for instance, at the period before the First World War, this was a period which many have talked about as a period also of globalization. But there were at least three important differences compared to the contemporary globalization. The first difference is that while you had free flow of commodities into the colonies and semi-colonies, into the third world countries who were not allowed to protect their domestic markets in the pre-First World War period, uh, the other advanced capitalist countries, other than Britain, which of course had its markets open, other countries had high tariffs. Germany, continental Europe, the United States, they all had tariff protection which they could resort to. So you really did not have universal adoption of unrestricted flows of goods across country borders. Likewise, when you look at capital flows, capital flows in that particular period up to the First World War, right from middle of the 19th century up to the First World War. During that period, capital flows were essentially, I'm talking about international capital flows, were essentially flows mainly between advanced capitalist countries themselves, or between Britain on the one hand and the newly industrializing countries of continental Europe and of the United States and other temperate regions of white settlement on the other hand. In fact, many have argued that capital flows were basically supplemented labor flows, that you had migration of people from Europe to the temperate regions of settlement. And that is the way that capital also flowed from Europe essentially to the temperate regions of white settlement. But capital flows from the metropolis to the third world were extremely limited. For instance, if you take the entire period of British imperialism, entire period, not just the period up to the First World War, you take the entire period, you find that less than 10% of Britain's direct foreign investment was actually invested, for instance, in India, which was its biggest colony. And that investment in turn went to sectors like tea, jute, and so on, which were basically supportive of the colonial pattern of international division of labor, namely producing primary commodities or at the most processing some of these primary commodities produced, but not capital flows that sustained the development of manufacturing in the countries of the third world in order to meet the global market. And that in turn, therefore, was essentially a part of the colonial division of labor and not something that was breaking the pattern of colonial division. The third way that actually the colonial period limited the kind of globalization that had occurred in that period was as follows: that in that period, Britain, which was the leading capitalist country of the time, which presided over the gold standard. Now, Britain was a country that essentially, uh, yeah, that made substantial capital exports and ran a current account deficit on its balance of payments vis-a-vis again these newly industrializing countries of the First World War, which were basically temperate countries of white settlement. In fact, it is amazing that Britain actually made capital exports to the very countries with which it had a current account deficit. So effectively, it was having both current account deficits and capital account deficits vis-a-vis these countries. Again, the United States, continental Europe, and so on. These were the Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. These were the countries to which Britain was making capital exports. Uh, on the other hand, the entire current account deficit which it had vis-a-vis these countries and the capital exports which it made vis-a-vis these countries were met through a process of what economic historians in India have called economic drain, an unrequited transfer of surplus without any quid pro quo from its colonies and semi-colonies, from the West Indies, from India, and so on, to Britain. In other words, Britain balanced its payments where it had a substantial deficit, both on current and capital accounts, vis-a-vis the newly industrializing countries of that time. It balanced its payments by actually having a drain of surplus from its colonies and semi-colonies, and also the colonies and semi-colonies were what were called markets on tap. Therefore, Britain exported its own industrial goods, which were no longer competitive with the industrial goods that were being imported into Britain from the advanced capitalist world of that time, from the newly emerging capitalist world of that time. And these goods, in turn, sold to the colonial, semi-colonial markets at the expense of local pre-capitalist artisan producers, and that caused the process of what is called deindustrialization and unemployment, therefore, in the colonies and semi-colonies. Now, the fact that Britain could actually drain away the surplus and had this kind of the possibility of deindustrializing the colonies to meet its current account deficit vis-a-vis the other newly industrializing countries is something which arose precisely because it was a colonial power. In the post-Second World War period, the United States, which actually occupied the same position that Britain occupied earlier, had no colonies. As a result, the United States, which originally was making foreign investments, capital exports, but subsequently it also began developing a current account deficit, particularly pronouncedly in the early 1980s. It also met its entire capital account capital exports as well as current account deficits. It met that. It could not meet it through any kind of drain. So it met this. It managed to balance its payments because under the Bretton Woods system that had prevailed, the dollar was supposed to be as good as gold. The price of dollar was fixed vis-a-vis gold at $35 per ounce of gold, and therefore everybody was obliged to hold on to dollars. Because the dollar was supposed to be convertible to gold, though nobody actually went around asking for a conversion. Now, as a result, what happened was that the US met its capital exports by printing money. Later, when the US got into current account deficit, it met additionally its current account deficit by printing money. So huge amounts of dollars started pouring out of the United States, and they were held with banks, that is the European banks and American banks. And when the banks held these dollars, the banks wanted to invest these dollars all over the world. They became a powerful force for overthrowing the Bretton Woods system that actually allowed countries to import capital controls. Therefore, you actually had, because of the fact that the leading capitalist country was meeting its deficits, current plus capital account, through printing money, you actually had this situation where enormous amounts of money were printed, got into the banks, and the banks then wanted to invest it all over the world. And the Bretton Woods system, which was put an impediment towards these banks going global in their investment plans, was overthrown, and you had the globalization of finance, namely that now finance could be invested anywhere. This globalization of finance is what drives contemporary globalization. And this globalization of finance and the formation of an international finance capital is something that happened precisely because of the fact that you didn't have colonies, and therefore you could not, the leading country could not meet its deficit by simply sucking out, siphoning out a surplus from the colonies, but it had to print dollars, which actually led to an enormous growth of finance, what is called financialization. The origins of financialization lie in decolonization. That precisely because the old colonial system was abandoned, when decolonization occurred, you actually had the financialization of the world economy. Subsequently, of course, this financialization was further aided by the fact that the oil producing countries, which actually most of whom had more or less nationalized their oil production, while earlier in the colonial regime, this was dominated by seven oil multinationals called Seven Sisters. But Seven Sisters' power weakened. The newly liberated or the newly emerging third world countries all nationalized their oil production. And of course, oil prices increased. The first oil shock in the early 70s, the second oil shock at the end of the 1970s. And all these oil shocks basically put huge amounts of cash in the hands of the OPEC countries, which in turn put them into banks, and therefore that aided the process of financialization. So the process of financialization occurred as a result, essentially owing to the end of the colonial empire. So the colonial period, even though it had seen some amount of globalization, did not see globalization of the kind that we are seeing today, where you actually have relatively unrestricted flows of commodities, services, finance, and capital across countries. Now, one thing which you do find because of this international formation of an international finance capital, which is moving all around the globe, is that we live in a very peculiar time. Globalized finance is really confronting nation states. The nation state is one which is confined, whose jurisdiction is confined to the nation. But finance is globalized. Therefore, finance can move from the boundaries of one nation state to another. It is this asymmetry, the fact that finance is globalized and the state continues to be a nation state, this asymmetry underlies the phenomenon, namely that the nation state willy-nilly has to listen to what finance wants it to do. That is called keeping up the confidence of the investors. Because if finance gets angry, in that case, finance simply leaves the shores of the country, precipitates a financial crisis. In the very recent period, last few weeks, there has been a significant outflow of finance from the third world to the first world, and this has happened because of the rise in interest rates in the United States and elsewhere. For instance, from India alone, about $100 billion have been taken out just in the course of the last few weeks. So finance can just go. at the drop of a hat, because of which nation states willy-nilly have to listen to what finance wants them to do. Therefore, this globalization of finance in a world of nation states has a number of implications. The first is that it abridges the sovereignty of the nation, because after all, if it is the case that the nation state doesn't like pursuing certain kinds of policies, but it is more or less forced to pursue them in order to keep up the investors' confidence, then essentially its sovereignty is limited. The second thing which happens is that it amounts to an attenuation of democracy, because democracy means people's ability to choose between alternative political formations which have different agendas. But of course, if it is the case that the country is caught in this vortex of financial flows, in that case, more or less all political formations which lack either the willingness or the ability or the guts to take the country out of these, in other words, to go out of this neoliberal paradigm, are political formations that would more or less be pursuing the same economic policies, namely the economic policies demanded by uh, globalized finance capital. How serious this outflow of globalized finance capital can be, and how it can constrain third world countries, is illustrated by a number of instances. I mean, for instance, even in South Africa, after the end of the apartheid regime, there was such a large scale flow of finance every day from South Africa that when President Nelson Mandela took charge of the country, he actually appointed as his finance minister a gentleman called Derek Keyes, who had actually been the finance minister under the apartheid regime. Why did he do it? Because in order to stem this outflow of finance, because of the fact that it was actually making life very difficult for the South African economy. So in situations where the country remains within the web of financial flows that globalization entails, you actually find that sometimes you have to have a prime minister that is acceptable to finance, certainly a finance minister that would be acceptable to finance and pursue policies which are acceptable to finance and so on. If you don't do that, in that case, you get into trouble with finance. You know that in Italy recently, a fascist government has come to power, but that fascist government came to power on the backs of the resignation of a gentleman called Mr. Draghi, who had been the earlier prime minister. Who's Mr. Draghi? Mr. Draghi is a person who was acceptable to international finance capital. He was basically he was actually a bureaucrat, an international bureaucrat, and he was placed there because international finance would feel more happy, more confident with him in charge. So it has very important implications about democracy, sovereignty, and so on. Additionally, I would like to additionally, I'd like to draw your attention to what it means for the class orientation, for the state, for the nation state itself. You see, uh, typically the earlier state that we had, typically when you have a state, the state is supposed to stand above classes. The state typically stands above classes, apparently neutral between the different classes, and it does things sometimes in the interest of workers, sometimes in the interest of peasants, and of course in the interest of the capitalists, even when it is a bourgeois state that is building capitalism. But now what happens is that this business of its standing above classes is something which is more or less jettisoned. And what the state does under the contemporary neoliberalism is that it actually stands firmly with the big business, with the corporate financial oligarchy, and looks after the interests of globalized finance, with which the domestic financiers, the domestic oligarchy, the domestic corporates, big ones, are actually integrated. They themselves then start going out, they themselves become international and so on, so that you don't actually have a conflict between the domestic big business and the international big business, but rather you have an integration between them. And the state is one that essentially looks after the interests of that particular class. Now, to the extent the state explicitly and exclusively looks after the interest of this class, it actually withdraws the kind of support which earlier it had extended before the pursuit of neoliberal policies towards the peasantry, towards petty producers, towards workers, and so on. Now, towards the particularly in countries, for instance, in India, where you have substantial number of peasants. This actually means input prices of peasants, which had earlier been subsidized. Now the subsidy is withdrawn. Output prices, which earlier had been guaranteed through a system of procurement at pre-announced prices and so on, is something which is withdrawn. In India, it hasn't happened yet for food grains, but that's because last year when the government tried to introduce this kind of a withdrawal of support for food grains, there was a massive peasant agitation, so the government backed down. But it has happened for cash crops. So you find that profitability in peasant agriculture drops. You find international agribusiness making an entry into the peasant agriculture in third world countries. And therefore, you find that many of the peasants in the third world countries find it difficult to make ends meet. And that is particularly true of cash crop peasants, where you have the no support whatsoever. And in Africa, where actually food self-sufficiency has been given up in this, under the dictates of uh, the agenda of globalized finance capital, you find that there is also food insecurity that has got introduced. Earlier, Africa produced substantial part of its own food grains, but now that is no longer the case. So, because of this, the real income of the peasantry, the real income per capita in peasant agriculture tends to drop. And when it drops, you find that a lot of the peasants then want to move to the towns and cities. In India, I know that between 1991 and 2011, 15 million peasants have actually moved to towns and cities in search of employment, because agriculture is no longer a paying proposition. Because, as I said, petty production tends to be squeezed under neoliberalism. Now, but on the other hand, the other feature of neoliberalism is that, to the extent that now country borders are open for trade flows, for commodity flows. Countries are competing against one another. For instance, you can have cheaper imports, and if you have cheaper imports, in order to withstand competition from cheaper imports, you have to introduce technological progress domestically. Therefore, the rate of technological progress increases considerably under neoliberalism, which means new processes and new products are introduced to a much greater extent than was the case earlier. Now, these new processes and new products typically are labor productivity augmenting, namely that they actually raise the rate of growth of labor productivity. Now, there is an algebraic truism that the rate of growth of employment is nothing else but the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of labor productivity. Now, if the rate of growth of labor productivity increases, in that case, this is something which basically means that the rate of growth of employment comes down, even though the rate of GDP growth might increase. In fact, this is what has happened in India. You find that the rate of GDP growth apparently has doubled, but the rate of growth of labor productivity has increased so much that the rate of growth of employment in the neoliberal period is about half of what it was earlier, about 1% per annum now compared to 2% earlier. Now, because of this, therefore, the increase in employment opportunities are not even enough to absorb the natural increase in the workforce, let alone absorbing the displaced peasants who are seeking employment in the metropolis, in the towns and cities. Therefore, there is a substantial increase in the proportion of what is sometimes referred to as the reserve army of labor, in the proportion of unemployment to employment, though it doesn't take the form of open unemployment. A given amount of work is then distributed among more people. So everybody is unemployed to a greater extent than before, but it's not as if the number of openly unemployed goes up, because in any case, even earlier, it was not the case that there were some fully employed and some unemployed, but rather there was a kind of situation where those who did not have enough opportunities for employment simply shared the work amongst themselves. This is what the system did, which also means sharing the income amongst themselves. Now, therefore, the rise in the reserve army of labor has the effect of even impairing the bargaining strength of the organized workers. So that the entire working people, whether you take the peasants, whether you take artisans, whether you take petty producers, whether you take the organized workers, whether you take the unorganized urban workers, the casual workers, and so on, you take the entire set of people that you can define as the working people. The per capita real income of the working people tends to go down. And this is something which follows from the rise in the ratio of the reserve army of labor in the total workforce. Now, this has at least two very important implications. Firstly, if you have the per capita real income of the working people, not just the workers, but the workers and peasants, and so on, which is not going up, but labor productivity in the economy is going up rapidly, then that basically means that the share of surplus in income tends to increase. Surplus is the total income minus the income of those whose labor produces the total income. So the share of surplus in income tends to increase. Now, this has been commented on by many others who, however, do not see the reason in this particular way, who do not explain the process in this particular way. For instance, people like Piketty and his group have been talking a lot about the rise in income inequality and the rise in wealth inequality. But the rise in income inequality they talk about is essentially because of this phenomenon, namely that on the one hand, you have far from the labor reserves in third world countries getting exhausted, labor reserves increase further proportionate to the total workforce. And this is something which is accompanied by high rate of growth of labor productivity, because of which surplus rises. And if the share of surplus rises, that amounts to a growth in income inequality. One implication of this growth in income inequality is, of course, that if you have a unit of income that is shifted, let us say, from a worker or from a member of the working people to the surplus earners, then the member of the working people would tend to consume more of this rupee than the surplus earners. So every such shift tends to a lowering of consumption in the economy, and therefore a tendency towards overproduction. Because investment follows whether there is greater utilization of capacity or not, whether the market is expected to grow or not. Investment is looking towards the future. The only guide to the future they have is what's happening now. So if consumption gets discouraged, then that affects the economy to start with. And that also means over time that investment gets discouraged. Therefore, you have a general lowering of aggregate demand, and therefore a general tendency towards overproduction crisis. That is, insufficient demand relative to the output that was being produced. So this overproduction crisis, this tendency towards an overproduction crisis, is something which we know that Keynes had said that the state can come in. in order to overcome this tendency towards an overproduction crisis. But for the state to do that, and this is one of the very important features of neoliberalism, suppose the state does that. The question is, how does the state finance its expenditure? Suppose the state spends $100 more of expenditures in order to enlarge demand in a third world country. The state, if the state does that by raising taxes from the working people, then the state is not actually adding anything to demand, because working people more or less consume their entire incomes, because of which if you tax them by $100, then their consumption goes down by $100. And if the state spends the same $100, there is no net increase in demand. So the state, if it wishes to come and stabilize the economy and not let it become a victim of overproduction, in that case, the state has to finance its expenditure either through a fiscal deficit, which means by borrowing, then you're not taxing anybody. Nobody's consumption is going to go down. Or alternatively, if the state finances its expenditures by taxing the rich and the capitalists, because they at least save a proportion of their income, and therefore if you take $100 from them, so half of it would come, let's say, out of consumption, the other half would come out of their savings. And when the state spends these $100, that generates demand worth $100. So the net increase in demand is 100 minus the 50, which meant the curtailment of their consumption. So the net increase in demand of $50. So if the state actually wishes to enlarge aggregate demand to thwart this tendency towards overproduction, then the state can do so by enlarging its expenditures, but finance this enlargement of its expenditures by either a fiscal deficit or by taxing the rich, taxing the capitalists generally. Now, this, however, is something which globalized finance capital does not like. It does not like this because obviously it would not like the taxing of the capitalists or the rich, because that is like inviting a tax upon yourself. And secondly, it does not even like a fiscal deficit, because all over the world at all times, finance has been always opposed to an enlargement of the fiscal deficit for raising the level of activity, for spending, let us say, more on welfare expenditures. Finance doesn't mind an enlargement of fiscal deficit which occurs in the process of helping itself. But on the other hand, finance would mind a raising of the fiscal deficit for generating larger level of employment. Because, of course, if the state does this kind of thing through a fiscal deficit, then in some sense, it's a delegitimization of capital. That basically then people are going to say, if the state is required for enlarging employment, why do we need the capitalists? After all, they are really not in a position to increase employment because they are not investing. They are not investing because the market is not growing, and therefore, let's get rid of them. So this fear haunts the capitalists. It haunts finance in particular, which actually is what Keynes had called functionless investors, because of which you find that they always, everywhere are opposed to uh, a fiscal deficit. So under a neoliberal regime, the state cannot really intervene to enlarge the level of activity. I know that recently in many of the advanced capitalist countries, there was an effort to bypass this by having larger fiscal deficit in the United States and even in continental Europe in the wake of the pandemic. But on the other hand, now we know that all that is gone, that actually there is going to be a further squeeze on government expenditures because inflation has reared its head, and therefore we would be back to orthodox neoliberalism. So in conditions of neoliberalism, the capacity of the states to intervene to overcome overproduction, tendency towards overproduction, is extremely limited. Therefore, the only way that historically they have managed to have a counter, or a sort of counteracting force against this tendency to overproduction is through the formation of asset price bubbles. This is what had actually happened in the US in the 1990s, when you had the dot-com bubble, and then when the dot-com bubble collapsed, the then chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, reduced interest rates until a new bubble had been generated, which was the housing bubble. After the collapse of the housing bubble, you actually find that again the Fed lowered its interest rates virtually close to zero, but on the other hand, that really did not produce any comparable bubble, which is why the world economy has been generally sluggish in the entire period following the 2008 collapse of the housing bubble. Now, you, the bubble works because of the fact that even though it is an artificial phenomenon, even though, which is why it's called a bubble, the artificial phenomenon makes people wealthy, temporarily. They know that eventually this wealth may collapse, this wealth may disappear, or large part of it may disappear, but nonetheless, to the extent that it makes them feel wealthy, even in for a transitory period, they spend more. They spend more on consumption, they spend more on investment, and so on, because of which there is an effect on the real economy. So even a fictitious growth of wealth through speculative activities in the asset market has this real effect of stimulating an increase in the level of economic activity. But even that is now not happening. We have had, I mean, for instance, the decade uh, which even before the pandemic struck, the decade that we had was the decade of the slowest growth among all decades in the post Second World War period of capitalism. So there is clearly a slowing down of the growth rate, and on top of it, you have the pandemic, which further worsen things. And now, even as the countries were coming out of the pandemic, they are now struck by an inflation which arises because the effect to stimulate the economy has led to larger profit margins, which underlie the contemporary inflation. Even though there's unutilized capacity, profit margins have been put up. And of course, in a situation of the Ukraine war, the in inflationary pressures and the sanctions on Russia, the inflationary pressures have become even worse, because of which everybody is now saying that the world is moving to a recession. Because interest rates in the US and all over the capitalist world are rising. The rise in interest rates is something which is going to not only push the world towards a recession, but the rise in interest rate would also mean that third world debt servicing becomes even more difficult. Many of the third world countries which have substantial amounts of debt would find it much more difficult to roll over this debt. So if they find it difficult to roll over this debt, then there would be a further erosion of their sovereignty. You can't pay your debt, all right, then your mineral resources must be handed over to some multinational corporations and so on. You can't pay the debt, in that case your public sector has to be, or residue, whatever remains of the public sector, has to be handed over to multinational corporations. So we are going to witness in the coming days not only a world recession, but also a situation of a substantial attack on further attack on the working people in the third world, working people in the developing world. And this is something which uh, is now unfolding itself. Neoliberalism itself had meant an attack on the working people, as I mentioned earlier, but now the crisis of neoliberalism is going to bring out a further concentrated attack on the working people. And we are already seeing evidence of this. Sri Lanka is there. I mean, in our own neighborhood, uh, Sri Lanka was an obvious situation, and you find, for instance, similar problems cropping up in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and so on. And in India, as I said, $100 billion have been spent by the central bank in stabilizing the currency, and it still hasn't succeeded in stabilizing. There is an exchange rate depreciation, which would going to happen all over the third world, but it has already happened in our neighborhood and in India, which only worsens inflation. So the coming days are really going to be days of great difficulty as far as the working people in the third world are concerned. But of course, this is a situation in which, because within the normal functioning of a neoliberal regime, there is little that can be done to stimulate activity, to reduce unemployment. Uh, this is a period in which many of these countries, the big business, the big bourgeoisie, backs fascist forces. So you have a worldwide emergence of fascism. Now, fascism is something which actually emerges in a period of capitalist crisis. The earlier Great Depression of the 1930s had actually produced the earlier classical fascism in countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, the crisis of neoliberalism and the unemployment, the burgeoning unemployment associated with it, is giving rise to a new wave of fascism all over the world, including all over the third world. Now, the features of this fascism are very clear. On the one hand, it actually is highly authoritarian, and it comes down heavily on any movements or agitations on the part of the working people to defend themselves against this worsening in their living conditions that I have been talking about, which was occurring secularly and which is now occurring in a further concentrated manner. So their organizing themselves becomes even more difficult because of the fascist attack by the state against the working people. The second thing it does is it changes the discourse, because it finds what I would call the other, namely some hapless minority group, either a religious minority or an ethnic minority or the racial minority, and then so on. Either it's the immigrants, or it is the blacks, or it is the Muslims, or whatever, in order to change the discourse so that it generates hatred against them. It actually holds them usually responsible for the crisis. And even when it does not directly hold them responsible, it actually creates a discourse where they are the target. In other words, then people actually do not see the crisis about how it is actually generated, but they rather are distracted into hating and fighting against this hapless minority. The third feature of fascism is that while it is doing so, it actually gives huge concessions to big business. This had happened in Germany, this happened in Italy, this is happening all over the third world as well. All fascist regimes are really regimes that give enormous benefits as far as a big business is concerned. At least certain sections in favored business even more than others, but big business generally. As a matter of fact, fascist groups always exist in any modern society, but usually as a fringe element. But they occupy center stage when you actually have a period of crisis in which they are quietly supported by big business, or sometimes even openly supported by big business, through money, through media support, and so on. And their votes just increased dramatically. I think Hitler before 1933 had got only 2% of the votes, and suddenly in 1933 his vote share increased dramatically. Similarly, in Italy, this fascist lady who has just come to power. Her party in the last election, just a few years ago, had got only 4% of the votes, but at the moment she has 26% of the votes. So there's a sudden upsurge in the votes for the fascists, for which, of course, there is a certain condition which is created because of unemployment and so on, anger against the establishment, though the fascists themselves are backed by the establishment. But the fascists take advantage of the anger against the establishment in order to come to power, so that then they can help the establishment and suppress people on the basis of whose support they have come to power. The fourth feature of fascism is not any standard authoritarianism. It is actually something which encourage, where you actually have fascist thugs who are in the streets. Fascism is not only a class movement, but it has a mass dimension as well. It actually mobilizes large numbers of lumpen youths who constitute its kind of army, and with them it tends to terrorize people. So fascism is now all over the world, an emerging force, and including in third world countries, Brazil, Bolsonaro, as I said, India, Modi, in Turkey, Erdogan, and so on. You can think of many examples. Poland, Hungary, Italy, Sweden, and so on. Everywhere you have fascist governments coming in, and even when they have not actually come into power, they have become very powerful, like in France or even in Germany and so on. Now, there is a big difference between contemporary fascism and the fascism of the 1930s. Fascism of the 1930s had actually meant overcoming the crisis of Great Depression. It did so through military expenditures, but on the other hand, it did increase employment. Therefore, there was a period when the fascists actually had acquired a degree of popularity because the war had not yet started, but on the other hand, unemployment had ended because of war expenditures by the fascists, and such war expenditures were typically financed through a fiscal deficit, typically financed through government borrowing. In today's context, exactly the problem which I was mentioning, which afflicts liberal bourgeois governments, is a problem which also afflicts the fascist governments. What is that problem? Namely, that in order for them to enlarge the level of demand, enlarge output, they must finance their expenditures either through a fiscal deficit or through taxes on the rich, neither of which are accepted to globalized finance. Therefore, even if the fascists come to power in any particular country, that country, they would still not be able to do much about unemployment because of this handicap, because of the fact that structurally that country would still remain part of this world of globalized financial flows, and therefore subject to the necessity for retaining investors' confidence. And therefore, you find that contemporary fascism is not going to resolve the problem of capitalist crisis. And the other thing, of course, that contemporary fascism has to function. It's not going to unleash wars. It's not going to burn itself out. It's going to function within a broad framework of a democratic shell. No matter how authoritarian it acts, no matter how dictatorial that society becomes, nonetheless, there's a certain democratic facade and shell which is sought to be maintained. Now, that being the case, it's conceivable that the fascists may actually be conceivable, may lose power, as in fact Trump lost power, and it's conceivable that Bolsonaro is going to lose power. But when they do lose power, since the democratic shell is maintained, they would continue to remain a powerful force. And of course, they may come back to power because of the liberal bourgeoisie, the newly formed liberal bourgeois government being unable to overcome problems of unemployment, to overcome the uh, overproduction crisis that I was talking about. Therefore, the only way to overcome fascism is to overcome the conjuncture that produces fascism. And that conjuncture is one of crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Therefore, to overcome the crisis of fascism, or you have to overcome the challenge of fascism, you have to overcome the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. I have argued that this crisis cannot be overcome within neoliberal capitalism itself. And therefore, to overcome the crisis of neoliberal capitalism, you have to go beyond neoliberal capitalism itself. What direction that is going to take, how can you go beyond neoliberal capitalism, are issues on which no clear vision is still exists. But on the other hand, I think the days of neoliberal capitalism have really come to an end. We are witnessing a dead end of the contemporary globalization. So the past of globalization was that it was a part of the colonial regime, and therefore it had its limitations. The contemporary globalization has rid itself from the colonial straps, but on the other hand, it is something which has actually, for reasons I've just discussed, it has actually given rise to enormous inequalities and a tendency towards overproduction to which there is no clear solution, which is why contemporary globalization has reached a dead end. The future of this globalization is that there is no future, at least within the way that so far we have been seeing it. Okay, I think I should stop there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik, for this very, very engaging and interesting lecture. We are grateful to you for having agreed to take a few questions. The online participants are requested to put their questions on the chat box, and I'll read them out to you. Meanwhile, in this audience, if there are questions, we will take them. Please raise your hand. We'll pass the mic on to you. Pravesh.
Yeah. Hello, Professor. This is Habrevesh. I am part of the Ideas course. So, well, with the current growth process has come to a point where there's no way of looking at profitability across the globe at large. So why is it a very distant possibility to think of capital to resort back to an idea of war profiteering and thus leading to global conflicts of different sorts? Uh, why is that not a serious possibility under the present juncture? If rising profitability is done through war profiteering, why can't one seriously think about it?
No, you see, when you say rising profitability, by the way, I should make it very clear that even though there is crisis of capitalism, which takes the form of unemployment, which takes the form of inflation and so on, which is going to further, because of rising interest rates, cause further unemployment and so on. At the same time, capitalist profits, at least the profits of big capital and so on, have not necessarily gone down, because capitalists make their profits not only out of the produced surplus value. You know, Marx talked about capitalist profits coming out of the produced surplus value because he was analyzing a certain capitalist economy and looking at its inner dynamics. But when you look at the real world, which is not only capitalism, but also all kinds of other things exist, uh, the profitability of the capitalists can be kept up even when production has suffered, even when there's unemployment, even when there's unutilized capacity, in at least two other ways. Firstly, all kinds of new products or all kinds of new things are becoming commoditized. And insofar as capital can actually have access to these commoditized things, I mean, suppose it is the case that forests forests suddenly become commoditized, okay, in which case the capitalists can get hold of the forest and earn profits on that. So commoditization, newer and newer commoditizations is something which is going to, which is one way that capitalist profits is actually held up. The other way is what Marx had called primitive accumulation of capital. That suppose agribusiness comes and squeezes Indian peasant agriculture, or squeezes peasant agriculture elsewhere. In that case, you can always have a profitability, profits which are actually boosted in that way. They can take over retail trade, in which case you can have profits at the expense of millions of retailers. So by profitability is not only through production, but profitability can be through dispossession of petty producers. Profitability can be through the enlargement of the sphere of commodity production, where they get hold of new assets almost gratis, or at very low prices relative to the products that they are going to sell from those assets, and so on. So we have to look at, so this period that I'm talking about of crisis of overproduction is a period in which it's not as if big capital's profits have come down. It's not as if finance capital's profits have come down. But coming to your specific question, namely war, you see, even to finance a war preparation based boom, as had happened in the 1930s, you require that demand must be raised, and demand can be raised if the war boom is financed through government military expenditure that is not that is not financed by taxing the workers. And there's not a moral point, but the point is that if you tax the workers, then their consumption goes down, and if you spend on armaments, then demand increases. There is no net increase. A net increase would be there if you actually had either a fiscal deficit or, as I said, taxing the rich. So the point is that, I'm not saying that a war is out. I mean, I don't visualize this as a real possibility in the foreseeable future, namely that militarization of large parts of the third world. But on the other hand, even if there was militarization, that simply would not generate employment unless it is financed in one of these two ways.
There are a couple of questions online. So I'll read out the first one. Uh, the question from Christine is, can interventionist states such as China or Latin American left governments provide possibilities to shift away from neoliberalism? What kind of restructuring on the national or global level will they need to do to facilitate this shift? That's
Yes.
one question. Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
Professor.
Yeah, I mean, of course, if you have a left-wing government that comes to power, not just in Latin America, anywhere, then that left-wing government, the first thing it would have to do is to take the country out of this web of financial flows. Otherwise, there's no sovereignty. Otherwise, your hands are tied. Now, if your hands are tied, you can do very little. Now, therefore, firstly, you have to take the country out of this web of globalized financial flows, and you have to do so by introducing capital controls. I'm not in other words, prevent capital from flowing out of the country. And if you prevent capital from flowing out of the country, capital would not even come into the country. And if it does not come into the country, then it may be difficult for the country which has a trade deficit to finance its trade or current account deficit. In which case, you would have to have some control on trade flows as well in order to make your balance of payments balance. So some degree of control on capital and trade flows would become necessary. I'm saying this not because I think this is a damn good idea, having trade controls and so on, but it would become inevitable that that you wouldn't be able to meet your deficits otherwise, because many third world countries have been meeting their deficit through the inflow of finance. If finance does not come in that case, they would not be able to meet the deficit. So some control on capital flows and therefore control on trade flows is absolutely essential if you want to have an alternative agenda. If you have to have an alternative agenda, then you must have the class support for it. The class support has to come from the working people, the peasants, workers, uh, craftsmen, fishermen, and so on, agricultural laborers. Now, they are not going to support you, and for you to carry credibility with them, you'll have to do things which are in their interest, which actually benefit them. You have to have welfare state measures. But how do you finance these welfare state measures? You have to finance these welfare state measures by taxing the rich, for instance, by having a wealth tax, by having an inheritance tax, and so on. Wealth inequality have increased dramatically during the neoliberal period. So wealth tax or inheritance tax in order to finance welfare measures. Then likewise, for this you have to have capital controls and a degree of trade controls. Development of agriculture as the basis of expanding the home market, because obviously you then, if you have controls on trade flows, you cannot really rely on export-led growth. You'd have to have home market-led growth, and home market-led growth basically implies that agriculture, peasant agriculture, has to be promoted, a sort of within an egalitarian agrarian structure. Uh, these are the kinds of measures. And of course, if private capital would go on a strike, which they would, in order to bring down this government, the government would have to mobilize resources and finance things through the public sector. So a public sector agricultural revival, um, control on capital flows, and as a consequence, some control on trade flows, and revival of the project of having a welfare state, which is financed by wealth taxation, inheritance taxation, and so on the rich. That's the kind of agenda that you require.
We'll take a question from the floor here. Yeah, Vinay.
Uh, Good evening, sir. It's a pleasure. It's been a 2-day force, your entire talk. I'm a little blighted by injury. My name is Vinay Brandon. I'm a participant in the Ideas course. So I had a question from the lens of regulatory theory, and whether there is any possibility of, say, new accords, capital accords and other accords emerging vis-a-vis infrastructure and technology, particularly cross-border kind of infrastructure investments. I'm mostly thinking of the OBOR, and which requires some kind of investment, sovereign investment in terms of building technology capacity. Is there a possibility within the liberal bourgeois framework to kind of manage this crisis a little longer vis-a-vis infrastructure and technology? Thank you.
No, but I mean, many questions are being raised, can be raised, many possibilities delineated, and so on. But what I have presented to you is, in a very simple form, a basic problem. Now the point is that nobody's going to make any investments. Capitalists are not going to make investments on infrastructure unless it is the case that the markets are expanding, unless you're in boom, unless the state actually begins to subsidize that. And if the state begins to subsidize that, how does the state finance it? State would finance it again through a fiscal deficit, and that would be unacceptable because there is a limit of 3% on the fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP in virtually every country, including in European Union and including even in third world countries. I'm really looking not at all that is possible that is being talked about, but I'm saying that none of what is being talked about is really a starter. It's a non-starter because of the economic impediment, which I mentioned earlier. So I do not see. I mean, the kind of possibilities you're suggesting, the kind, and there are similar possibilities being suggested by many others. But the point is that none of it is a starter unless you actually can manage to get out of the constraints to which neoliberal capitalism has brought us. I'm not sure. In other words, I don't want to discuss these might have beens or may happen unless it is the case that there is some macroeconomic plausibility of uh, these things being put into effect. And as I mentioned, the plausibility of any expenditure by the state is very limited because it's not going to increase demand if it is financed by taxes on the working people. Look at the way, look at the way that the state is now in country after country trying to overcome the crisis. They are doing so by giving handouts to the capitalists. Now, if you give handouts to the capitalists, in that case, how do you finance these handouts? Firstly, giving handouts to the capitalists doesn't help at all. Unless the demand is rising in the economy, unless utilization is rising in the economy, they're not going to make an iota of additional investment. They will simply pocket the handouts. And how do you finance the handouts? You finance the handouts by let's say, taxing the workers. Now, if you do that, then demand goes down because of the fact that the capitalists pocket whatever you give to them, but what they pocket is taken from the workers who would have otherwise consumed it. Therefore, demand actually goes down. So what the government is trying, government in many third world countries, which are constrained by within this neoliberal framework, what they are trying to do to revive the economies is actually counterproductive. It's not just in the no use, they're actually counterproductive. Just imagine what happened in Britain, which is an advanced country. The new Prime Minister of Britain, Liz Truss, decided to give tax concessions to the capitalists and to finance it by a fiscal deficit. As a matter of fact, finance capital itself actually objected to this. They don't like fiscal deficits, even though the outcome of the fiscal deficit might actually have come to them, but they at the moment do not like fiscal deficits being incurred in the British economy for a variety of reasons. Okay. Now, therefore, she had to go back on it. So the point is that within neoliberalism, there is no idea other than giving transfers to the capitalists at the moment doing any rounds in economic terms.
We will take one last question, which is online. Okay, we don't have much time. One last question. This question is about women's labor, women's unpaid labor. And the question is, how does women's unpaid labor mitigate the total degradation of the working class and subsidize processes of capital
Degeneration.
accumulation? What other links can we make between financialized liberalism and the substandard conditions of working class women in global periphery?
You see, one of the really striking things that has happened is a very sharp decline in women's participation rate in the workforce. In other words, whenever unemployment increases, you find that women's participation rate goes down because the discouraged worker effect is something which is particularly acutely felt as far as women are concerned. Now, I know this has happened in India in a very big way, and I'm sure you'll be having lectures on this later. But the thing is that therefore, women really bear the brunt of the crisis because they are at the same time the ones who are unemployed, and being unemployed, they even drop out of the workforce, and therefore they actually take the real brunt of the crisis. And likewise, whenever there is a reduction in family consumption on account of unemployment and reduced incomes, it is the women's consumption that goes down the most. This is something which is a very old result. So a situation of crisis is a situation which is the worst for women compared to the others. And so they are the real, the most pronounced victims of the crisis. By contrast, in a period in which there is a boom, there is a rising participation rate, reduced unemployment rate, there's substantial increase in women's participation rate, and therefore there's a substantial, and this also has its effects on domestic violence, it has its effects on, I mean, it has its effect. It has its socio-psychological effects. Is something which I'm not going into, but they're very important. In a period in which there's a boom, women then assert themselves much more. They actually, kind of, their independence is greater. In fact, in the former socialist countries which operated pretty close to full employment. In fact, they operated close to full employment, the labor scarcity. A substantial increase in the participation of women in the workforce, substantial increase. And that affected the nature of the family, that affected the women's independence and assertiveness, etc. So these are issues I'm sure you'll be discussing in many of your courses. But on the other hand, let us be very clear that a period of crisis is the worst as far as women are concerned.